The photograph was already on every entertainment site before I even opened my eyes that morning. My husband, arm around another woman, stepping out of a car I didn't recognize, in front of a house I had never been invited to. The caption called her his fiancée. Nobody had told me my marriage was over. Not my husband. Not my lawyer. Not even the woman standing in my place. I found out from a stranger's comment section. And in exactly 4 months, I was going to be standing on the same stage as both of them, accepting an award neither of them thought I deserved. Stay with me, because what happened between that photograph and that stage is something my husband never saw coming, and by the end of the story, you'll understand exactly why silence can be the loudest form of power a woman can hold. My name is Adaeze Bell, and for 18 years I believed loyalty was something you built brick by brick, not something you were owed for free. I grew up in Houston, the daughter of a nurse and a high school football coach, two people who worked themselves thin so I could go to college without debt hanging over my head. I studied architecture because I loved the idea of taking something broken or empty and turning it into something people wanted to live inside. I met Callister Whitfield during my final year of grad school at a fundraiser neither of us actually wanted to attend. He wasn't a billionaire yet. He was just a tired, ambitious real estate developer with 3 half-finished projects and a mountain of debt from a father who'd left him a company and nothing else. We talked for 4 hours that night about buildings, about ambition, about the kind of life we both wanted to build from nothing. I didn't fall for his money. There wasn't any yet. I fell for the version of him that still asked questions instead of giving orders. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony that his family barely attended. I noticed that early on and told myself it didn't matter. His mother, Delphine Whitfield, made it clear in small, polite, devastating ways that she had imagined someone else standing beside her son. Someone who looked more like the families in the country club photographs lining her hallway. I told myself time would soften her. I told myself Callister's love was enough to fill in the gaps his family left open. For years, I was right. We built his company together, literally. I redesigned his failing developments into award-winning properties. I was the one who convinced investors to trust him again after his first company nearly collapsed. By the time he was 38, Forbes was calling him a self-made billionaire, and almost nobody outside our home knew that half of what made him self-made had my fingerprints all over the blueprints. I never asked for credit. I told myself a good partner doesn't keep score. But somewhere in the last 3 years, something in our marriage had gone quiet in a way I couldn't explain. Callister started traveling more for site visits that never seemed to produce actual sites. He started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. He stopped asking about my work and started talking about optics and image and how the company needed to look a certain way to the right rooms. I told myself it was stress. I told myself every marriage has a season like this. I had no idea I was already being erased, one quiet decision at a time, long before that photograph ever existed. Looking back, there were smaller signs even before that, the kind you only recognize once you know what you're looking for. Callister had started asking our household staff to schedule his calendar directly through his office instead of through me, something he'd never done in 15 years of marriage. He'd stopped bringing me to smaller investor dinners, calling them boring and not worth my time, even though those exact dinners were where I'd once closed some of our most important early deals. I remember feeling a strange, unnamed unease during that period, the kind that sits in your chest without a clear cause, the kind you talk yourself out of because naming it feels dramatic. I told myself I was imagining things. I have since learned that women are almost never imagining things. We are simply the last ones willing to admit what we already know. The first real crack came on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day you don't remember until later, when you're forced to replay it looking for warning signs you missed. I was picking up dry cleaning near his downtown office when I saw his car, the matte black SUV I'd helped him pick out 3 years earlier, parked outside a boutique hotel I knew he had no business reason to visit. I told myself there were 100 explanations. A meeting. A colleague borrowing the car. Anything but the one explanation that later turned out to be true. I didn't confront him that day. I didn't even mention it. I drove home, made dinner, and smiled when he walked in the door, because some quiet, self-protective part of me wasn't ready to hear the answer yet. 3 weeks later, Callister told me he had to attend a real estate summit in Miami, alone, because the trip involved closed-door negotiations that required a certain image. I remember exactly how he phrased it because it was the first time in 18 years he had ever used the word image to explain leaving me out of something. I smiled and told him to travel safe. Inside, something in my stomach had already started sinking, the way it does right before you know something is about to break, even if you can't name what yet. He came home 4 days later with a tan he shouldn't have had from a conference room and a new watch he didn't explain. Asked him where it came from. He said it was a gift from an investor. I let it go. I always let it go. That was my mistake, and it was also, in a strange way, the exact thing that let this story unfold the way it eventually did. It was my assistant, Renata, who first said the name that would end up rearranging my entire life. She mentioned, almost in passing, that a woman named Celine Vance had been introduced at a company gala as Callister's creative consultant, a title that didn't exist anywhere in our organizational chart. I remember laughing it off in front of Renata, but the moment I was alone, I searched the name. Celine Vance turned out to be a former pageant queen turned lifestyle influencer, 29 years old, with 500,000 followers and a carefully curated feed full of luxury hotel lobbies that I now recognized. My hands were shaking by the third photo, not because she was younger, not because she was beautiful, but because in one image, taken from a rooftop bar, I could see, just barely in the corner of the frame, the exact matte black SUV I had seen outside that hotel weeks earlier. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him that night either. Something in me had gone very still and very calculating, the way people describe feeling right before they make the most important decision of their life. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I started documenting. I pulled up old calendar invitations. I cross-referenced his site visits with Celine's public location tags. I quietly asked our longtime driver, Marcus, who had worked for our family for over a decade, if he'd noticed anything unusual on recent trips. Marcus went pale before he even answered, and that silence told me more than any confession could have. For 2 more months, I lived inside my own marriage like an outside investigator, gathering evidence in a life I was supposedly still a full participant in. During those 2 months, Renata became something between a friend and a co-conspirator, though I never let her carry more of the weight than she needed to. She was the one who first noticed that Celine's name had quietly started appearing on internal vendor lists, listed as a brand consultant being paid a monthly retainer out of a discretionary marketing budget Callister controlled directly. I remember sitting with Renata in my office late one evening, both of us staring at a printed invoice, neither of us saying what we were both thinking. That invoice, small and administrative as it looked, was the first piece of paper that proved this wasn't just an affair. It was already being built into the architecture of the company itself. The betrayal, it turned out, wasn't just an affair. It was infrastructure. Celine wasn't simply a mistress hidden in hotel rooms. She had been quietly folded into Callister's public narrative for almost a year. She'd been introduced to key investors at private dinners I wasn't invited to. She'd been photographed at charity events wearing jewelry from a collection Callister's company sponsored. She had, without my knowledge, become the face our brand was slowly being repositioned around, while I, the woman who had rebuilt that brand from bankruptcy, was being quietly written out of the story one press release at a time. I remember sitting in my home office at 2 a.m, staring at a marketing deck I wasn't supposed to have access to, watching my own name disappear from slide after slide of the Whitfield legacy, replaced instead with vague language like visionary leadership and a stock photo where a woman who was very clearly meant to resemble Celine stood beside Callister in an artist's rendering of our own headquarters lobby. That was the night I stopped being confused and started being strategic. I understood, with a clarity that almost frightened me, that if I confronted Callister with raw emotion, I would be handed exactly the narrative his family had always wanted: the difficult, jealous, emotional wife who couldn't handle her husband's success. Delphine Whitfield had been waiting 18 years for a reason to say, "I told you so." I was not going to hand it to her wrapped in a bow. So instead of confronting Callister, I did something far more dangerous. I kept showing up exactly as I always had. I smiled at galas. I hosted his investors. I let him believe, completely, that his secret was still airtight, while I quietly rebuilt my own foundation underneath him, plank by plank, the same way I'd once rebuilt his failing company from nothing. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from performing a marriage you already know is over, and I want to be honest about how heavy that period was. Some nights, after Callister had gone to bed, I would sit alone in the kitchen we designed together during the early, hungry years of our marriage, and I would let myself grieve quietly for exactly as long as I needed, before folding that grief carefully away and returning to the work of protecting myself. I never let anyone see that exhaustion, not even Renata. I had learned a long time ago that women who show their wounds too early often get told to be reasonable before they've even finished bleeding. The photograph that leaked to the public, the one that started the story, was an accident, and it wasn't even the real turning point. I know that now because I was the one who understood, weeks before the rest of the world did, exactly what Callister was preparing to do. Through a contact, my name, meanwhile, was being scrubbed from company materials under a polite corporate phrase, restructuring the public-facing leadership narrative. I was being edited out of my own life, like an inconvenient paragraph in someone else's press release. I want you to imagine what that feels like, discovering that the person you built an empire beside has already started planning your erasure while you're still sitting across from him at breakfast, still asking about his day. I didn't cry when I found out. I went completely quiet instead, the way water goes still right before it turns to ice. Because underneath the shock, something else had started forming, something colder and far more useful than heartbreak. I remembered every awards ceremony I had ever quietly declined to attend on his behalf, so the spotlight would stay on him. I remembered every industry panel I had turned down interviews for because Callister said it was better for the brand if he was the public face. I remembered 18 years of standing one careful step behind a man who was, at that very moment, actively planning to replace me in every photograph of the life we had built. And I remembered something else. Something Callister himself had forgotten. I still held 42% of the company's shares in my own name, a protection my father had insisted on before the wedding, back when Callister had nothing and everyone assumed I was the one being naive. My father, who had passed away 6 years earlier, had been a quiet, careful man who never trusted verbal promises, only paper. I remembered sitting across from him the week before my wedding, watching him slide a folder across the table and tell me that love was real and worth trusting, but contracts were what protected you on the days love stopped being enough. I had rolled my eyes at him then, 26 years old, and certain I would never need such protection. Sitting in that home office all those years later, I finally understood exactly what he had been trying to give me. Not distrust. Armor. The public photo leaked 3 days after I learned all of this, not because I orchestrated it, but because Celine, eager for her own spotlight, had gotten careless with a location tag. Suddenly the story wasn't a quiet internal rebrand anymore. It was a headline. Reporters called my office within hours. Old friends sent condolence texts disguised as concern. Delphine Whitfield called me directly for the first time in 3 years, her voice dripping with a kind of satisfaction she barely bothered to hide, asking if I needed help processing everything, as though she hadn't spent nearly 2 decades hoping for exactly this outcome. I thanked her for calling. I did not give her a single piece of the reaction she'd hoped for. Callister, for his part, didn't call me that day at all. He sent a text 4 sentences long, explaining that things had evolved between him and Celine, that he hoped I would understand in time, and that his legal team would be reaching out about next steps. Next steps. 18 years reduced to a phrase you'd use to describe a home renovation. I read that text twice, set my phone down, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel every single thing I had been holding back. Then I stood up, made myself a cup of tea, and opened the folder I had been quietly building for months. Here is what Callister did not know, and what his lawyers clearly hadn't warned him about before he sent that text. My 42% ownership wasn't just a paper technicality. It came with a voting clause my father had built into the original agreement, one that required my sign-off on any major rebrand, any change to public leadership representation, and any restructuring of the executive board. Callister's team had been quietly preparing to replace me in every photograph, every press release, every public appearance, without realizing that legally, they could not replace me in the one place that actually mattered: the boardroom. 2 weeks after the photo leaked, Callister requested an emergency board meeting to formally announce Celine's new role as Chief Brand Officer and to introduce a rebrand campaign built almost entirely around her image. I sat at that table in a navy suit I had chosen specifically because it was the same one I'd worn the day we secured our very first investor, 18 years earlier. Callister barely looked at me when I walked in. Celine sat 2 seats down from him, dressed like she already owned the room. I let them present their entire pitch, slide by slide, without interrupting once. I let Callister explain how Celine represented the future of the brand. I let him use words like fresh and modern and aligned with where we're heading, each one landing like a small, deliberate blade aimed at the woman who had built the walls he was currently standing inside of. I watched the other board members throughout that presentation, and I noticed something Callister apparently hadn't. Several of them looked uncomfortable, glancing occasionally in my direction, clearly aware that I was sitting through my own quiet erasure without a single word of protest. One of them, an older investor named Harlan Wickham, who had been with the company since its earliest days, caught my eye briefly and gave the smallest, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as though warning Callister without saying a word that he was about to make a very serious mistake. When he finished, I asked for exactly one thing: the floor. And for the first time in the entire meeting, I watched something flicker across his face that looked almost like fear, because he suddenly remembered exactly who was still sitting across the table from him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't mention Celine by name once. I simply opened my own folder and, slide by slide, walked the board through 18 years of the company's actual financial architecture, showing precisely which projects had failed under Callister's original leadership and precisely which ones had turned the company profitable under joint decisions I had personally led. I showed them the original investor deck I had built by hand the year we nearly went bankrupt, the one that had saved the company before Celine Vance had ever posted a single photo online. And then, calmly, I reminded the board of the voting clause tied to my shares, the one that meant no rebrand, no leadership restructuring, and no new chief brand officer could move forward without my formal approval. The room went completely silent. Callister's face had gone pale in a way I had genuinely never seen before, not even during the worst financial year of his career. Celine, to her credit, tried to salvage the moment by suggesting that perhaps we could find a version of this that works for everyone. I looked directly at her for the first time all meeting and told her, calmly, that I had spent 18 years building something for everyone and that the version she was describing simply wasn't one where I disappeared quietly from my own legacy. I did not approve the rebrand that day. And under the terms of the very agreement Callister's family had once mocked my father for insisting on, without my approval, nothing moved forward. After the meeting, Harlan Wickham stopped me in the hallway, something he had never done in all our years working together. He told me, quietly, that he had always suspected the company owed more to me than anyone publicly admitted, and that watching me hold that room the way I had reminded him exactly why he'd invested in this company in the first place. It wasn't much. Just a hallway conversation between two colleagues, but it was the first time in a long time that someone inside that world had said the truth out loud without me having to fight for it. Word travels fast in industries built on image, and within a month, the story had shifted in a way none of us fully controlled. Reporters who had originally framed the leaked photo as a scandal about an aging billionaire's new young partner started asking a very different question. Who actually built the Whitfield real estate empire? A financial journalist from a major business outlet, someone I'd spoken with years earlier during a profile piece Callister had insisted I decline, reached back out, this time asking if I'd be willing to go on record. I thought about it for exactly one night. Then I said yes, because I understood that silence had protected Callister for 18 years, and I was done being the quiet architecture behind someone else's spotlight. The interview wasn't bitter, and it wasn't a confession of betrayal, though I could have made it exactly that. Instead, I did something that ended up being far more damaging to Callister than any scandal could have been. I simply told the truth about the work. I walked through the failing projects I'd redesigned. I explained the investor relationships I'd personally rebuilt after his father's original company nearly collapsed. I described, in careful, factual detail, exactly how much of his empire had been built on decisions and designs that were mine. I never once mentioned Celine. I didn't need to. The industry did the math on its own, and the narrative that had originally painted me as a discarded wife quietly reshaped itself into something else entirely, a portrait of the woman who had actually built the empire everyone assumed belonged to one man. Callister tried, briefly, to control the fallout. His team pushed a counter-narrative suggesting I was bitter and exaggerating my role out of jealousy over Celine, the exact narrative I had spent months preparing for. But it fell apart almost immediately because, unlike accusations, my claims came with documents. Original blueprints with my signature. Investor emails with my name in every critical negotiation thread. A financial rescue plan, dated and time-stamped, from the year the company nearly folded, written entirely in my handwriting. You cannot gaslight paperwork. Delphine Whitfield, who had spent 18 years suggesting I didn't belong in her son's world, went suspiciously quiet on every platform she usually used to comment on our family's business. Then came the part of the story that even I hadn't fully anticipated. 4 months after that leaked photograph first appeared online, I received a call from the National Real Estate Innovation Council, informing me that I had been selected to receive their Lifetime Achievement Award, an honor given once a year to a single individual whose work had fundamentally reshaped the industry. I sat in complete silence on that call for almost 10 full seconds, because the award ceremony, scheduled months earlier, before any of this scandal had even begun, was the same industry gala where Callister and Celine had originally planned to make their public debut as a couple. The universe, it turns out, has a very specific sense of timing. I said yes before I even let myself think it through, because somewhere between the boardroom and that phone call, I had stopped being the woman quietly erased from her own life story and started becoming someone the entire industry was about to watch step directly into the center of the room Callister had once tried to push me out of. In the weeks leading up to the gala, I found myself preparing in a way that felt entirely different from every event I'd attended in the past. In the past, I had prepared to support someone else's evening. This time, I prepared for mine. I met with a stylist for the first time in years, not to compliment anyone standing beside me, but simply because I wanted to feel, walking into that room, exactly as powerful as the work I had built. I wrote and rewrote my speech more times than I could count, cutting anything that sounded like anger, keeping only what sounded like truth, because I understood that a room full of investors and executives would remember composure far longer than they would remember outrage. The night of the gala arrived faster than I expected, and I remember standing backstage in a deep emerald gown I had chosen specifically because it was nothing like anything I had ever worn to one of Callister's events. This dress wasn't chosen to compliment him. It was chosen for me. I could hear the murmur of the crowd through the curtain, hundreds of the same investors, developers, and executives who had spent 18 years assuming I was simply the well-dressed woman standing beside a brilliant man. Tonight, for the first time, I wasn't standing beside anyone. Callister was already seated near the front when I walked out, Celine beside him in a dress clearly designed to draw attention, though tonight, for reasons she hadn't yet realized, all the attention in that room was about to belong to someone else. I watched his face change in real time as the MC began reading my accomplishments aloud to the room, describing projects and financial turnarounds that, until 4 months earlier, most of that audience had never associated with my name at all. I watched Celine's smile falter slightly as the applause grew louder with every sentence, because she understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly whose legacy she had tried to insert herself into. When I finally stepped up to accept the award, I didn't look at Callister once. I looked out at a room full of people who, for 18 years, had quietly underestimated exactly how much of that empire had been built by hands they never bothered to credit. I kept my speech short. I thanked my parents, who had taught me that real value doesn't need to announce itself loudly to be real. I thanked the mentors who had believed in my early designs before anyone had money riding on my name. And then I said one sentence that, according to 3 separate people who texted me afterward, made Callister visibly flinch in his seat. I said that the best buildings and the best legacies are rarely built by the person standing in the spotlight, but by the person willing to do the quiet work no one else wants to do, and that I was done doing that work in silence. The room gave me a standing ovation. Callister did not stand. Celine, seated beside him, stared straight ahead, her carefully practiced smile completely frozen in place, as though she had just realized, in front of hundreds of witnesses, that she had spent a year trying to replace a woman whose absence the entire industry would have noticed immediately. I didn't need revenge after that night, because something better than revenge had already happened. The truth had simply caught up to the story on its own timeline, in its own room, in front of exactly the people who mattered. In the months that followed, the fallout continued in ways I never had to orchestrate. Investors, uneasy about the instability surrounding Callister's leadership, began requesting stronger corporate governance, effectively ensuring my role in company decisions became permanent rather than something I had to keep fighting for. Celine's brand partnerships, several of which had been contingent on her public image as the future of a respected company, began quietly dissolving once that future looked considerably less certain. Callister, for the first time in his adult life, was forced to rebuild his reputation not through charm or image, but through actual, verifiable work, the exact currency I had been trading in for 18 years while everyone assumed I was simply along for the ride. As for me, I used the momentum from that night to finally step fully into the spotlight I had spent nearly 2 decades avoiding. I launched an independent design and development firm under my own name, one built specifically to mentor young architects, particularly young Black women, who had been told, the way I once was, that their value in this industry was best expressed quietly, from somewhere just behind someone else's success. Within a year, that firm had 3 major projects of its own, none of them requiring anyone else's name on the blueprint to be taken seriously. I still remember the first young designer I hired at that firm, a 24-year-old named Bianca, who reminded me so much of myself at that age that it was almost unsettling. She told me, during her interview, that she had almost turned down the opportunity because she assumed a firm this respected wouldn't take her seriously without a more established name attached to it. I told her exactly what I wish someone had told me 20 years earlier, that the most respected name in any room is the one attached to the best work, and that she never needed to borrow anyone else's spotlight to prove she belonged in it. I saw Callister once more, several months later, at another industry event neither of us could avoid. He approached me carefully, almost cautiously, and said he hoped that someday I could forgive him. I told him, honestly, that forgiveness might come eventually on my own timeline for my own peace, but that it would never require me to forget what he had tried to do, or to pretend that being written out of your own life is something a person simply gets over because enough time has passed. I told him I hoped he found whatever peace he was looking for. And then, for the first time in 18 years, I walked away from a room without waiting to see whether he was watching me leave. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have seen clearly while I was still standing inside that marriage. Being erased teaches you, in the most painful way possible, exactly how much space you are always taking up. Callister didn't just try to replace a wife. He tried to replace an architect, a strategist, a woman who had quietly held half the weight of an empire on her own shoulders while being told her presence was optional. He learned, in front of an entire industry, that some foundations don't crumble just because someone tries to build a new structure without asking who is holding the original one up. I lost a marriage that had already been hollowed out long before that photograph ever leaked. But I gained something far more permanent. My name, finally, standing on its own, in the one place that had always belonged to me.